So, I recently went and saw Rise of Skywalker in the cinema. Yeah, I know, I'm pretty late to it, but I couldn't get in before Christmas, and then I wanted to go see it with someone who wasn't available until recently. It took a little time, but I did eventually get there. And I've now sat down to think about it for just a couple of days, to gather my thoughts and to hear other people's opinions. And honestly, I haven't seen a Star Wars movie so polarizing before. It seems that the fanbase is very much torn on whether this is a good movie or a bad movie. The same thing happened with The Force Awakens, but not many people argued it was a bad movie. People were more just disappointed that it was a retelling of A New Hope. But with Rise of Skywalker, you do have the two polar extremes of love and hate. And I personally fall into the category of loving this movie. But I can understand and see where people are coming from when they criticize it. I understand all of the hate that is coming towards this movie. So I'm gonna just say the reasons why I feel like this movie is good and why I love it. And once again, if you hate this movie, I completely understand where you're coming from. I too have my issues with it. Before I get into why I love this movie so much, I want to have a quick look at what I thought of the last two movies. I loved The Force Awakens so much. I was absolutely swept up in the hype that was surrounding this movie. That kind of hype where everyone was reacting to the trailers on YouTube and crying. I was in that camp of being absolutely buzzing for this movie. Tears came to my eyes when I was watching it, as I watched Harrison Ford reprise his role as Han Solo. I got to see Chewbacca again, Princess Leia, Luke Skywalker. It was nostalgia trip. While that's not a good way to make a movie, it was certainly enjoyable. And it may have been a remake of New Hope, but I personally feel like Star Wars needed to tread in those shallow waters before they jumped right into things. After the disasters that were the prequels, which was something so opposite from the originals, they needed to kind of re-establish that feeling. I really liked the mysteries that J.J. Abrams set up. I loved the new characters that he introduced with Rey and Finn and Kylo and Snoke. They were all interesting. I couldn't wait to see how they developed and progressed and where their arcs would lead them. I just couldn't wait to see where this movie went in general. My god, this was an absolute failure of a movie. It completely fails to lead on from the previous movie or honour anything that had been set up prior in the entire series. It throws all of the plots and mysteries that J.J. Abrams created down the drain in favour of telling its own story that feels incredibly disconnected and separate from what was set up in The Force Awakens. Only loosely tied together because they couldn't just start the story anew, they had to tie it back somehow. It was clearly not handled in the way it should have been, and while Rian Johnson is not a bad director in any way, shape or form, I cannot believe that Disney greenlit this movie the way they did. They should have come in and gone, whoa, no, 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 what the hell are you doing? The Last Jedi did have some cool moments, but the amount of bad moments or pointless moments or moments where you're just yawning outweigh them. And it just ended up being this complete mess of a movie that, let's face it, hardly anyone enjoyed. This movie received prequel level backlash because of how bad it was. And it is currently my second least favourite Star Wars movie, only just edging out Attack of the Clones. Because good god, that movie is fucking dreadful. So here we are, The Rise of Skywalker, the final movie in the new Disney trilogy. This movie had a hell of a lot to do. It needed to re-establish the story that J.J. Abrams had started telling, while also being able to tie up that exact same story in a nice, neat little ribbon that fans would enjoy and would find satisfying. It most obviously went through a lot of hell while it was being made. You don't need to read articles and watch YouTube videos on all of the behind-the-scenes drama to see the kind of effects that it had on the final outcome of the movie. Just when you're watching it, you can tell there was a lot of things thrown in towards the end, things that weren't working correctly, all behind the scenes as it was being made. A lot of the choices that were made for this movie were also very clearly made because they didn't know where to go with the story after how Rian Johnson dealt with The Last Jedi. They didn't know who they should have as a villain, because obviously Snoke would have been the final villain for this movie, but now they didn't have him. And even more questions were raised than were ever really answered. Like, how did Palpatine survive? He was thrown down a shaft in the Death Star, his dark side energy exploded out of him, implying death, and then the Death Star promptly exploded, where Luke only just had time to escape it. But somehow this old age pensioner managed to get thrown down into a shaft, hit the bottom, and then drag himself out, get on a TIE fighter, and fly away without being noticed before the Death Star exploded? That doesn't make sense. When did Palpatine have a child? Who did he have a child with? Why was he never an active father? I mean, he clearly wanted an apprentice. Was his son not Force sensitive in any way? Clearly not, but then I thought he probably would have just killed him for being useless. He is Palpatine, he's pretty evil after all. Why did Luke try to kill Ben for having some of the dark in him, but then decided to openly embrace Rey when she was arguably even darker and he knew this? I know he went through a lot of changes as a person when he was on that island and realised the error of his ways. But surely if Luke was scared of the darkness as well, he would look at Rey and go, oh Jesus Christ, this is going to be a disaster. We also now have the question of, is Finn Force sensitive? It's so heavily hinted at throughout the movie with how he senses things going on with Rey and senses things going on within the Force that other people just can't. It's so clearly similar to that relationship that Leia and Luke had where they could sense each other through the Force. At what point was Force healing introduced to these movies? I may have blanked The Last Jedi out of my mind a little too much here, but I don't recall that ever being a thing that was established. When we're in a pit with the serpent and Rey just suddenly heals it with the Force, not only can you tell it's going to come back later and be used to save a major character from death, way too obvious, but you just kind of have to ask yourself, at what point did she develop this power, and at what point was this even a power, considering it hasn't been set up in any of the movies? And perhaps my biggest gripe with this movie, albeit a very minor thing, is at the end of the film where Rey calls herself a Skywalker. No, you're not. You did not earn that. Rey has not earned that right to call herself a Skywalker. At all. Dear God, no. I understand you can't say your last name in public, Rey, but no, you are not a Skywalker. Bad Rey, I will hit you with a newspaper. I imagine that these questions that the movie has raised are going to get answered in future comics and novels further down the road, but really, they should have been addressed in the movie instead. Fans shouldn't have to go out and then pick up the comics and the novels just to understand core elements of this film. It's kind of like how Bungie locked all of Destiny's story and lore away in the Grimoire card. I shouldn't have to go to a separate source just to enjoy the thing I want to enjoy. So, now that I've ragged on about this movie, you're probably thinking, I hate it. But as I've said, I don't. I like it. Why do I like this movie, is the question now. I personally feel like it did enough things right to the point it finished the series in that neat little ribbon that I previously mentioned. Although neat may not be the word, but at least it did put a ribbon on. There's a lot of questions that still haven't been answered and a lot of stories that could still be going, but there's a ribbon there and it works. Kylo Ren's story ended in a very satisfying way for me. He was the only character to get a real story arc throughout the entire trilogy, and it was great to watch him develop and to battle with the light side and the dark side of the Force. For the feelings that he had towards his family, the feelings he had towards Rey, Snoke, Palpatine, the First Order. It was so great to watch him develop as a character. In this movie, the First Order for once actually felt intimidating. The gigantic fleet that Palpatine raised out of the ground, the Final Order, certainly did not feel intimidating, but the First Order did. They seemed a lot more akin to the space Nazis that they were presented as in the last two films, without all of the pathetic shouting at each other that made them so impossible to take seriously. When the First Order was around, people were genuinely scared. When they were going door to door and rounding people up, you knew that there was fear involved. They actually felt like an intimidating threat on the galaxy, and that was brilliant. The action in this movie is also just fantastic. Rey fighting Kylo on the Death Star is one of the coolest lightsaber battles that I've seen. It's really great to watch. It's not ridiculously fast-paced, like the lightsaber battle in Revenge of the Sith, but it carries that same weight of the lightsaber battles that we saw in Empire and Return of the Jedi. Another great thing that this movie did, albeit once again, how did he survive, was having Ian McDiarmid back as the Emperor. Ian McDiarmid is always fantastic when he's playing this character, and he knows it, given the fact that he's played the character in the original trilogy, the prequels, and has also voiced this character throughout the Clone Wars and the Rebels series, because he knows he is the Emperor, and he knows he is damn good at it. While I don't feel like Palpatine should have been in this movie in any way, and was clearly a, oh fuck, we don't have Snoke, what are we gonna do decision, having Ian McDiarmid back is fun to watch. There is no denying that. Palpatine is always fun to watch on screen. He's a cool villain, he is an intimidating villain, and he continues this trend in the movie, despite being hooked up to some weird robot because he can barely move and looks like he's on the verge of death. And this movie was all round just fun to watch. The new characters as well were fun and exciting. Still highly underdeveloped, but pretty much every character in this trilogy is highly underdeveloped, so we can just ignore that to a certain extent. But I was never bored while I was watching this film. It didn't feel like a complete carbon copy of Return of the Jedi. The end battle definitely had Return of the Jedi vibes to it, and by Return of the Jedi vibes, they basically did Return of the Jedi again, but added more ships in because they thought it would look cooler. But it was just such a fun movie to watch. You are never bored. There isn't a moment like there is in The Last Jedi where you're looking at it going, this is just the most boring thing ever, why are we doing this? I don't want to be watching a casino. None of that is present within this movie. They managed to pack in all of the action, the fun, the excitement that should come with a Star Wars movie, even though they had so much else that they needed to focus on as well. They managed to do it, and that was good. I left the cinema feeling satisfied with what I had seen, and that's what counts the most. This movie most certainly had a ton of issues, and I can see every single one of them, and believe me, I wish they weren't there. I wish that this was a better movie. It shouldn't be a case of the fan base being divided on whether or not they love it or they hate it. It would be lovely if this movie was so perfect we all just loved it. But unfortunately, that isn't the case. And when we look at this within the context of the overall Star Wars series, this movie makes very little sense. The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker just don't fit into the story and the saga in a way that feels natural or even right in any way. If anything, they kind of take away from the original trilogy by changing how we perceive events, abilities, and characters that were shown within that movie. But if we look at these three films as their own separate trilogy, completely removed from all of the previous movies that we dearly love, Rise of Skywalker was a nice enough ending to this story. It certainly doesn't hit in the same way Return of the Jedi did, where it felt perfect and well concluded. The story here still feels like it should be going on, with the characters being developed, these questions being answered. But in general, it does make a decent enough ending for this new trilogy. And I've personally taken to not seeing these as Star Wars movies, but their own separate thing. Viewing these films as their own separate trilogy that is disconnected from Star Wars makes it a lot more enjoyable. Because yes, this does take away from a lot of the great things of the original trilogy. This trilogy did not need to exist, and does clearly exist only to make Disney more money to swim in. But when looked at on its own, yes, it has problems. Yes, the movies are not good. At best, 2 of them are mediocre and 1 is a monumental fuck-up. But at the end of the day, I could sit down and re-watch this trilogy and still enjoy myself. I would definitely like to do that when all 3 of them are out on Blu-ray, just have a marathon. Because it'd be interesting to see how we feel then, once we can watch all of these in quick succession. It's also going to be incredibly interesting to see what people think 5, 10, 15 years down the road. When the prequels came out, we hated them as a fan base. They were panned by critics and fans alike, to the point Hayden Christensen and Jake Lloyd decided they didn't even really want to act that much anymore. Yet here in 2020, those movies are loved, minus Attack of the Clones. I don't think anyone likes that film. It's so fucking boring. Even the lightsaber fights suck. It'll be interesting to see how people perceive these movies in 10 to 15 years, when all of this hype around them has died down. Because currently, we are still swept up in this new Star Wars hype. And that is probably driving a lot of what people's thoughts and reactions are towards this film. I'm looking at it without that hype, because I went into this movie with no hype whatsoever. I'd seen such a polarized reaction to it, I couldn't be excited and I couldn't be worried. I just went in neutral. And I think that's why I enjoyed it the most. I didn't go in expecting the most amazing movie ever made. I didn't go in expecting original trilogy levels of great. But I also didn't go in expecting Attack of the Clones levels bad. Once all of this hype has died down around the films, I do strongly think that people's opinions on them will change. They will forever be not good movies. They will forever be bad Star Wars movies. But I think we will be able to sit down and watch and enjoy, at the very least, The Force Awakens and Rise of Skywalker, and maybe to some extent The Last Jedi, a little bit more than we've been able to do at the moment.